Greetings, one and all. Steve the Amateur Historian, and I'm coming to you from North Portland, more specifically the Sabin neighborhood, or at least I'm on the edge of the Sabin neighborhood as I understand it. And this is going to be the site of what is actually kind of a rarity in this series, which is a murder case I cover that actually took place in northeast Portland. I'm heading towards that location now along 19th, and I'm going to tell you right out of the gate, we're probably not going to get much of a view of the house. And the house where this case happened is still there. It was built before this incident happened, but unless things have changed drastically since the last Google Maps imagery, this house has a lot of foliage, trees, shrubs, all that stuff kind of in front of the house, so you can't really see it that well. But you know me, that don't matter. There's a case to be discussed. So let's do that now on a new episode of Historic Murders of Portland. So it's the summer of 1921. My apologies, you're probably gonna hear an assortment of random outdoorsy noises like lawnmowers, because it's a summer's day today, much like in this story. And this story, when it comes to domestic situations that ended in murder, it checks off all the stereotypical points from the action itself clear through the trial. So in this case, we have a fellow named Joseph Henderson and his wife Gertrude Henderson. They also had two children. They had a son named Keith. They had a daughter that went unnamed in the newspaper pieces I read, so I don't know exactly what her name was. And like so many other marriages, theirs was a tumultuous one. And after all of this drama, which they don't really go into the details that much, but during this time, usually if a tumultuous marriage finally ended in divorce, it was because the husband was doing a litany of things. He's probably abusive, he could have been an alcoholic, any number of things, but unfortunately they didn't really give the details. But in June of 1921, the two split officially, and I'm about to go up a very steep staircase while I continue telling this story. I hope you appreciate what I do for you guys, but I need to go this way anyway. So finally, Gertrude gets a divorce from her husband, takes the kids, and either finds a new place or is possibly staying with her father, a guy named J.E. Beach, who owned his own place and is where Gertrude was with the children, particularly on August 8th, 1921. And it's the same old story. Joseph Henderson gets himself a gun and a knife and proceeds to head towards Beach's house, where he knows Gertrude and his children are staying at. But he claims he's going there for, this is what he said in the immediate aftermath, which this story changed at trial because stories always do. He claimed that he was going there to try to pull off a reconciliation with his wife, and, you know, just happened to bring weapons along. As he would claim, he said he brought the gun and he brought the knife because he was concerned that when he showed up that Beach, the father, would threaten his life. And from what I've gathered reading newspaper articles about this, he wasn't even home when Henderson showed up. Now, maybe Henderson didn't know that, but the fact of the matter is, you bring a knife and a gun to go see your estranged wife under the guise of a reconciliation during a time where husbands were snapping and killing their wives for leaving them all the time. You know, it was such a, you know, stab to their ego. And this guy wants us to believe that this is all on the up and up. He was innocent. He just wanted to see if he could make things work with his wife again. And what better way to make that happen than to bring weaponry with you? Now that's mysterious. Anyway, right around the corner here, I'm gonna take a right, and 4 houses down and on the east side of the street is where the home in question is that Beach lived at, where the encounter between Joseph Henderson and his wife occurred. Now, again, this happened in 1921, and yeah, it looks like there's still a lot of foliage in front of the home, but this home was built according to Trulia, or, you know, whatever website I used. This house was built in 1905, so the crime in question happened in this house, and I'm just gonna do a quick walk by. You see these 3 kind of trees standing up. It's the house that's in, yeah, kind of, you can see the top of it there. This is the house where Beach lived and where this encounter happened. I'm gonna do a pass by and then tell you the grisly details of what happened. Hopefully I got a good enough view of that for you. Like, there's part of the roof poking out right there. But again, you know, as I've said in the past, if it's a private home, I don't like to linger too much. I don't want to be standing in front of someone's home videoing it. So I just gave you a quick walk by. Might include some old pictures if there are any to be found. But that is where J.E. Beach lived, and it's where thought they were gonna blare their siren. And that is where Joseph went, gun and knife in possession, to go see his wife to try to smooth things over. This White House right here, absolutely a drug house. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Literally all the windows are like, have stuff put over it. The door looks almost like nailed shut. There's like random messages on there, like instructions for people that show up there. Maybe that's a little too obvious, but anyway, that's what's going on now. But anyway, so I'm heading a little bit north, ultimately to get to a new location. But in relation to things that transpired at the beach home that I just walked by, actually the best explanation for the events that happened in there came from a neighbor of you know, the beach home, who I assume knew Gertrude personally, because in the aftermath of what happened, Gertrude managed to stumble away and flee from the home, and she fled to this neighbor, and she managed to give her, probably in a great deal of pain and probably kind of fading in and out, she managed to kind of abruptly explain to this neighbor all the events that had transpired. And as this neighbor relayed the story given to her by Gertrude Henderson, her husband showed up. Again, there's no mention of whether the father was even there, even though that was supposedly the only reason that, like, Henderson brought weapons with him. And it didn't take long before, you know, whatever circumstances were actually happening there, it didn't take long before Joseph Henderson started getting aggressive and violent. And it's probably because his wife didn't want to go back with him. I mean, they'd been through a lot together, and she didn't want to deal with the, you know, pain and suffering of their marriage anymore. You know, a lot of women back then, you know, not only was marriage frowned upon, or marriage, not only was divorce frowned upon back then, but, you know, a lot of women endured a lot from their husbands, especially if husbands threatened them, if they threatened to leave them. So women had a lot of incentive to just stay in marriages, no matter how bad they were. So when a woman finally did divorce her husband, it was usually after a pretty lengthy succession of really bad things happening. So I can only assume that that was the case here, at which time Gertrude had no interest in reconciling with this man. And he, at that time, pulled his gun on her and backed her into a corner kitchen area. You know, gun in hand, she's going to obey him, because what are her other options here? So he backed her into a kitchen, and once he had her cornered in there, I don't know if he just holstered his gun or set it on a counter or what, but he began choking her. That was the next thing that happened, probably just out of some kind of blind rage, I would think. So amidst this choking, as that's happening and he's fighting her and she's trying to obviously get away, she's probably scared out of her mind, all of a sudden then Joseph, whatever he went by, he went for a knife. Now, again, I said he brought one with him. That was inferred in one of the articles, that he brought a knife with him. So I want to assume that is the weapon he pulled. But they were in a kitchen. Maybe there was one on the counter, or there was a knife block nearby. I'm not dead certain exactly where he got this thing from, but he got it. And it looks to me like this was just blind rage. This was not a guy interested in a reconciliation. This was a guy that, you know, maybe when he went there, he was like, come home with me now. Stop this crap. But I mean, he pulls a gun, he backs her into the corner, he starts choking her, and then he grabs a knife, and it's like he's just so full of rage that he's just like, his brain is vacillating from like violent method to violent method. This is not a guy in a stable mind. This is not a guy trying to do the right thing. He just ain't. And so he pulls up the knife, and in the struggle, he stabs Gertrude in the back, just below the shoulder. He stabbed her twice in that area, and he ended up cutting right through one of her lungs. That was the primary injury that she sustained from this experience. And at that moment, their son Keith, who was just a little boy, I think he was only like 4 or 5 years old, came running in and tried to stop his dad. I mean, what would you do? You're trying to protect your mom. And, you know, you've probably been taught over at least the last couple of months that your dad's not a great person. He's not all there, maybe. So the child is probably going to eventually side with the mom. And so he ran in there like a damn hero and tried to jump on his dad and make him stop. And it probably actually stopped Joseph from stabbing Gertrude more. But as there was already a scuffle ensuing, as that happened, Joseph ended up turning around and stabbing his own son. Now, the son did survive. I'm putting that out for you right now. The son was injured. The son did not die. He ended up getting cut across the cheek. And once that happened, he freaked out and ran away. And their daughter, who I also believe was fairly young, was upstairs. And she probably didn't know what was going on till the aftermath. When Joseph had arrived, he told her, go upstairs right now. And, you know, kids, they obey their parents. So Keith ran away, and in that tussle, that brief interruption of what Joseph was doing to his now ex-wife, she managed to get away, and that's how she escaped the house and got to the neighbor's place and managed to give the neighbor this description of events, which is probably the most reliable account, even though Gertrude was not doing well at that moment. But I mean, were you honestly going to believe anything Joseph Henderson was going to have to say about this case? Probably not. So Gertrude did escape. She did get to the neighbor's house. They got an ambulance to come and take her to the hospital. But unfortunately, by the following day, Gertrude Henderson died of the wound. That again, the primary damage was it cut right through her lung. And she could probably barely breathe her last several hours. So it was probably, several hours was probably a very long and painful death before Gertrude expired. And now you don't just have an assault, you have a murder on your hands. I mean, based on the description of events, it seems pretty clear Joseph Henderson came there at least thinking, I may end up killing my wife. And it almost ended the way that so many others have, which is, the husband is already scorned. He's already just completely lost emotionally. And then he goes and kills his wife, and it's like, well, what more do I have to live for? I may as well kill myself. So their son Keith runs away. Gertrude runs away. Joseph Henderson's like, oh crap. He runs out of the house on 19th and begins running north. People nearby said they saw him running towards the vicinity of Alberta Park, which would be kind of back this way a little bit, just a little southeast of us, since I've been traveling north since passing by the beach house. But he ultimately ended up right in this area that I'm at now, because Joseph Henderson's mother lived in this particular area. And I'm now coming to 13th and Rose Lawn. This is 13th. Rose Lawn is this crossing street. Got some nice art here. And it's crazy because right down here, Rose Lawn, this right here, this was Crack Alley, like these several blocks here going west. This was Crack Alley, Portland. This is where, I forget, they said there were like 10 crack houses over a couple block stretch. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about something that existed way before that. So over my shoulder, we're looking east on Rose Lawn, and as you can see, it's a dead end. It dead ends right before hitting 14th. Well, Joseph Henderson's mom back in 1921 lived on this little dead end. Like once you get to there, it's over. And she lived, I want to say, in a home that was on the north side of the street, which would be over here as opposed to this side. So Joseph fled from the scene where he stabbed his wife. We're, I don't know, 5-6 blocks from there, something like that. And he fled to this dead-end street and fled and actually hid in like a chicken coop that his mother had there. I don't know if his mom raised chickens or just, that was a thing. People just had chicken coops on their property. So obviously, the ambulances come and pick up the, Gertrude's body, but obviously the police are now looking for the husband who fled the scene, and again was last seen running towards Alberta Park, which is just north of where, or a little bit north, and I think just hinting slightly east from the beach home. So he actually would have been kind of going off this way, but he would have had to wrap around and come back this way because we're actually a little northwest from where Gertrude was murdered. So the police eventually, they got to cover all their bases. So they come here to Joseph's mother's house. And I think it's pretty clear she knows he's there. She probably even knows why he's there and that he's kind of, like hiding in her backyard. But of course, she's a mother, so she's like, oh no, my son's not here. And the police don't believe it for a second. Either they're desperate to cover all their bases or she's giving them a tell like, oh no, not my son. And so they start searching the property. And as they go around into the backyard of Joseph Henderson's mother's house, they see Joseph Henderson hiding in this chicken coop, and he has a shotgun and he's fully prepared to just shoot himself through the head. And he'd already like slit his wrists, but apparently didn't do a very good job of it because he was still alive. And once he saw the police come around that corner and he kind of knew the jig was up, he actually like shot himself. But unlike a lot of stories where that's the beginning and the end, like, oh, he knew this was the end and he took himself out, this guy somehow, you know, he failed to kill himself by cutting his wrists. He failed to kill himself by shooting himself. The police took him in and he survived all of this. So I hate it when it happens that way. You know, this wife gets one stab in one area and it just happened to hit the right place, just enough to kill her. This guy just tries to obliterate himself in a succession of different ways, and he just couldn't get the job done. And probably a lot of it was he really didn't want to kill himself. He was probably just doing it to let himself off the hook. And when you really don't have it in your heart to do something like that, you know, you might make intentional mistakes, or mistakes that are, you know, almost subconscious, that will, you know, save your life by, you know, a hair. So he ends up surviving, and of course a while later he gets a little healed up and he has to go on trial for what he's done, and all the classics come out in relation to this. It was a moment of temporary insanity brought on by all this trauma because his wife had left him and he was alone and he couldn't deal with it. Every single time, you know, a man or a woman went on trial back then for killing their wife, their husband, their ex, what have you, it was always, oh, it was temporary insanity. Like, nobody in this world is capable of handling a divorce without killing someone. And it wasn't even like, oh, there's just certain people that have, you know, mental issues, and those are the ones that will, you know, handle a breakup or a divorce in this manner. Which, you know, at least they'd be giving credence to the fact that, you know, they'd be acknowledging mental illness a lot better than they used to back then. But it wasn't even that. It was just that was constantly a go-to. And it's like, well, what about all of the hundreds, thousands, millions of divorces that happened wherein neither party attempted to kill each other? But anyway, so Henderson goes on trial. Oh, it was a moment of brief insanity. Oh, his wife left him and he couldn't deal. And he immediately, and I think he used the fact that he, you know, did successfully shoot himself, that I think that it was very easy for them to use that as a way for him to just act like he had no clue what happened. And, you know, he shifted the whole thing, and he pretty much went by this narrative that, oh, I don't really remember much of what happened. And, you know, he didn't, you know, everything went black is how he put it. He, you know, didn't really remember anything much after showing up at the home to talk to his wife. I mean, isn't that convenient? And, you know, he goes on trial and he says like, oh, well, the only reason I brought the gun with me was because, again, I feared that Gertrude's dad would do something if he ever saw me there. But it wasn't, he didn't say I brought it out because he was there and saw me and threatened to hurt me. It was, if I ever showed up again, he would do it. So there's still no reference to the dad actually being on the scene at that time. And yet he says that's the reason he pulled his gun out there at the scene. So he's kind of like mixing up his past and present tense. And it's like, well, when you pulled the gun out, there's no newspaper, no information I saw said that the dad was actually even in the house. But it was more that he made this threat in the past, and that was supposedly why he brought the gun. So he got that detail all screwed up. And he also said at trial, again, he initially says, oh, I went there for a reconciliation with my wife. And then on trial, he says all he remembers is that he just went there to see his kids. So it wasn't about a reconciliation with his wife. He just wanted to see his children. So again, you know, even that part of his story flip-flopped and bounced around. And he showed up and he said, I want to see my kids. And Gertrude said no. And that's when I, you know, pulled my gun and everything went black. And he had no memory of the stabbing. I presume he had no memory of the choking. He had no memory of actually hurting her seriously. and probably a vague, if anything, memory of the aftermath of running to his mom's house and shooting himself. So he played that game. He played the, oh, I'm a victim too, I got shot. And it was like, well, you shot yourself. So, you know, but it was convenient to try to use that to his favor, to be like, well, you know, you can't call me a cold-blooded murderer. I mean, I didn't intend to go over there to do that, and I don't really remember anything I did. I must have been blinded by insanity, and then I shot myself, so now I really don't remember anything. They would go to some truly obscene lengths, husbands would, to try to, well, you know, and husbands were so, you know, they were number one and their wives were always number two. So, you know, you had husbands who murdered their wives in cold blood and still felt like, well, I'm the husband. You can't, there was a minimal real acknowledgement for the fact that they were a bad person. They did this horrible thing to someone that they're supposed to love. It was like, well, I'm the husband. You know, that's really as far as, you know, the thinking goes. So they'll do anything to get themselves off the case. What they did really wasn't all that bad. You know, I'm the victim here. My wife left me. If my wife didn't leave me, none of this would have ever happened. Yeah, sure. So it's fair for your wife to have to live in misery, stuck with your worthless ass for the rest of her life. But for her to do the just and proper thing, which is to leave you and your worthless ass, that's wrong. Some real incel logic when you get down to it. But, you know, when it comes down to it, no matter how horrible the things are that some people do, they'll do everything they can to avoid having to pay retribution for it. The consequences are not something they want to face. So there was a decent amount of information to glean from the trial proceedings, and actually there was a third. Forgot to mention this. There was a third reason that was ultimately given by the guilty party in the situation as to why he went to the house. There was he wanted a reconciliation and all that mess. He also claimed that he wanted to go there to see one of their children who he was under the impression was dying of diphtheria. I don't know if there was any validation to that, if the kid actually had diphtheria, but that was another reason he gave. But honestly, Joseph Henderson was so messed up. I mean, you know, from the attempted suicide, he was so messed up by trial. I mean, at least as far as we're led to believe, you know, this guy could have also been exaggerating things for the sake of getting sympathy, even though the reason he was so messed up were due to his own actions, which were, you know, cowardly actions to try to, you know, escape having to face justice for what he had just done. But, you know, like, he implied he couldn't even, like, remember how old he was. He couldn't remember his birthday, stuff like that. Pretty much implying he was practically a vegetable. And, like, but of course, he remembers, like, nothing about killing his wife and not really anything about, you know, like, almost killing himself. But he does remember the reasons, these, you know, great, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know. But these, you know, genuinely caring reasons for why he went to see his ex-wife in the first place. He remembers the parts of the story clearly that made him look good. But the stuff that didn't quite look so good, he conveniently just, you know, had forgotten. And interestingly enough, it did come out at trial, this last little wrinkle to the story, which doesn't justify Joseph Henderson's actions at all, but, you know, it just kind of goes to show you don't know everything about a situation. And as I mentioned at the start of this thing, the Hendersons' marriage was kind of a rough and tumble one. And one of the sons, Thane, who I believe was this, I may be wrong, but I believe Thane was the child of theirs that supposedly had diphtheria. He claimed on the stand that his mom, Gertrude, had been seeing another man while they were still married, and apparently she'd fooled around with a couple of different guys. And again, you know, their marriage was so in and out, in and out, in and out. I'm not justifying, you know, infidelity on the part of the wife, but I think even that little detail in this whole thing, because I think if you hear the details, like, I think Joseph Henderson was prepared to, if not kill his wife, at least attack her. I think he was fully preparing to do her harm. if she was resistant to him because of how violent he became. Threatened her with a gun, he stabbed her, he choked her, all that stuff. That doesn't just happen. So I think that little detail helped. Oh, well, she was a cheater, so, you know, that kind of thing had an effect on trial juries back then. That wasn't the only situation. I mean, the fact that this guy could barely even, you know, remember who he was, and that he was such an he was so unreliable, both in defense of himself, also in terms of the prosecution trying to get their story straight. So it was one of these trials that it was kind of destined to not be very open and shut. I think this was at least a case of second-degree murder, at least. But in the end, it ended up being a sentence of manslaughter. And I think because of all these little inconsistencies, and in the end, I still don't think they quite fully knew whether they could, or at least the jury, I don't think knew with 100% certainty he went there to kill his wife. Again, based on the violence of the whole situation, I think he went there, and if his wife didn't do what he wanted, whether that was a reconciliation or whether he wanted to take some of the kids away with him, whatever, I think he fully intended to do her harm and possibly kill her if necessary. Maybe he didn't go there with the intention of killing her. Maybe he just went there with the intention of scaring her. But the fact of the matter is, he snapped and killed her pretty quickly, pretty viciously. So I think second-degree murder is more than fair enough for this guy, but he escaped with a case of manslaughter because it was one of these cases where there was just enough question, and Joseph Henderson was so far gone at that point. You know, I mean, I think it was hard for people to not at least have a little sympathy for the guy, and the fact that his wife had been cheating on him, again, maybe had an effect. So he escaped the death penalty, because I feel like, even though I don't quite think it's a first-degree charge, I think he definitely could have been found guilty of first-degree murder and, you know, been executed not so far on down the road, because back then they executed you quick after your conviction. You didn't have 15 years to file appeals and things like that. So Joseph Henderson, if you can put it that way, I mean, who knows, he was probably kind of messed up for the rest of his life after this failed suicide attempt, but he did manage to escape a multiple number of possible charges that would have probably kept him in prison. I know it said his manslaughter charge carried a maximum 15-year sentence, so if you can get away with doing something like that and only do 15 years for prison, he kind of got it. You didn't quite get away with it, but you got off easy compared to what you could have experienced. And that's really where the story ends, is Joseph Henderson going off to prison to do his time. And, you know, Lord only knows what he was like for the rest of his life, how much longer he lived, all that stuff. I have no idea, because all the information I find, especially when you're relying mostly on old newspapers, it kind of ends when the trial ends. They send him off to prison or death row or whatever, and they're kind of done with him. So that is the tragic story of the murder of Gertrude Henderson in the presence of one of their children, who again tried to come and break it up, and then the child ended up getting stabbed in the cheek by his father and escaped with just that injury. But a pretty violent, aggressive murder on the part of this guy, and then of course all the drama afterwards. So as always, thank you so much for stopping by, watching today's video, for supporting this channel, for supporting this series, and for supporting me. And I'm trying to get the phone. Okay, there we go. The light from my phone was blocking my face. And if you're new to the channel, haven't done it yet, remember to like, share, subscribe. Hit up my Patreon. Multiple links to other things. My Facebook, TikTok. I'm doing this completely out of order because I haven't done it in a couple, like 2 weeks. But yeah, my Facebook, my Instagram, my TikTok, Reddit, subreddit, all that stuff is available. And links that are in the description with this video if you want to help me out that way. And all that said, everybody, thank you again so much for watching, for stopping by. This has been Steve the Amateur Historian with another episode of Historic Murders of Portland.